They thought they could drain my land and walk away. The HOA said my wetland was useless, just a patch of mud holding back their plans for luxury homes and walking trails. So they brought in machines, pipes, pumps. They sucked the life out of a living ecosystem I'd spent my entire life protecting. No permits, no warnings, no remorse. But nature doesn't forget. The Beavers returned. They built, they redirected, they took the storm the HOA never planned for, and overnight, the water turned. The same homes they bragged about flooded, from the ground up. Basements collapsed, yards drowned, koi ponds swallowed whole. And as the HOA screamed for help, it was their own illegal plans that sealed their fate. You want to know what happens when arrogance meets the wild. Let me show you. This is how the land fought back. The wetland never looked like much to strangers. To most folks, driving past on the newly paved road, it was just a ragged patch of cattails, dark water, and mud, sometimes steaming in the chill of early morning, sometimes alive with a low chorus of frogs when spring finally broke through. But to me, Thomas Langley, it was far more than scenery. It was home in the deepest sense, a living, breathing sanctuary that had belonged to my family for 3 generations, a place that held secrets and shared them only with those willing to stand still long enough to listen. After 25 years with the U.S. Forest Service chasing wildfires through choking smoke, rebuilding habitats after clear cuts, and learning firsthand how bureaucracy can crush even the healthiest ecosystems, I retired with a permanent limp in my left leg and a modest pension. My wife Ellen had lost her battle with ovarian cancer 2 years earlier, and our only daughter Claire had built her own life in Vermont with her husband and 2 small children. When the time came, I loaded what remained of my life into an old pickup and drove back to the land my grandfather had left me. It lay on the frayed edge of a booming suburb just outside Asheville, North Carolina. 40 acres of wetland and second-growth forest, surrounded now by rows of identical beige McMansions, perfectly edged lawns, and gleaming concrete sidewalks, all governed by a brand-new homeowners association called Silver Pines Estates. In just 3 short years, the wild thickets and whispering creeks I remembered from childhood had been replaced by stucco walls, 3-car garages, and streetlights that glowed orange all night long. The HOA had money lawyers' ambition and a very clear vision of what proper landscaping should look like. What they lacked was any reverence for what had come before. My cabin, built by my grandfather in the late 1960s, sat high on treated pilings, raised well above the floodplain. He had been a quiet man, a Vietnam veteran, who came home restless and found peace only when he traded rifles for soil samples and war stories for lessons about water and wildlife. He taught me everything I know about wetlands, how they filter toxins from groundwater, shelter endangered species, and swell like living sponges whenever the mountain rains came hard. Over evenings on the porch, pipe smoke curling into the dusk, he would say, "This marsh will outlast every committee that tries to tame it." The land always answers back, Thomas. Always. When I moved in, the place welcomed me the way an old friend does. Dragonflies skimmed the surface of the ponds, their wings catching sunlight like stained glass. The air carried the rich scent of damp earth pine resin and the faint sweetness of buttonbush in bloom. A modest beaver dam near the southern boundary slowed the creek just enough to keep shallow pools alive through dry spells. Great blue herons stood motionless in the shallows while white-tailed deer left delicate tracks along the muddy edges. Once at twilight, I caught sight of a rare bog turtle sliding off a half-submerged log, an encounter that felt like a quiet blessing. For the first few months, life settled into a gentle rhythm. I rose before dawn, checked water levels with a simple staff gauge my grandfather had carved, and walked the narrow trails I'd known since boyhood. I set up trail cameras to record the comings and goings of otters and mink-mailed soil and water samples to former colleagues still in the field, and began sketching plans to turn the property into an outdoor classroom for local schools. The ache in my leg eased in the cool mornings, and for the first time since Ellen's death, I slept without the weight of grief pressing on my chest every night. Then the letters began. One crisp October morning, I found a pink envelope tucked into my mailbox, embossed with the Silver Pine logo of Silver Pines Estates. Inside was a polite but firm notice of noncompliance. My untended landscape, it claimed, was lowering neighborhood property values and creating an unwelcome visual impact. They requested that I remedy the situation within 30 days. I stood on the porch and laughed out loud, the sound startling a kingfisher from the reeds. My yard was a state-recognized wetland protected by a conservation easement signed in 1982. There wasn't a single blade of fescue, a plastic flamingo, or a garden gnome anywhere on my 40 acres, just cattails, willows, and the slow heartbeat of water moving through the soil. I sat at the kitchen table that evening and wrote a careful reply. I explained politely but unmistakably that my land was zoned differently, lay outside HOA jurisdiction, and was officially classified as critical habitat by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. I enclosed copies of the original deed, the easement, and a 2019 ecological survey. I thought that would settle it. I had underestimated their determination. A week later, luxury SUVs bearing Silver Pines decals began cruising slowly past my driveway. Sometimes they stopped so passengers could snap photographs. One afternoon, while I was pulling invasive reeds near the northern fence line, a woman stepped out of a gleaming white Escalade. She wore a tailored red blazer, oversized sunglasses, and an expression of practiced sympathy. "Mr. Langley," she called, heels clicking on the gravel. "That's me. I'm Karen Delaney, president of the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association." She extended a manicured hand, which I shook while wiping mud from my own. "We've received your letter. I just wanted to speak with you neighbor to neighbor." I waited. She gestured toward the marsh. "If you were to drain some of this standing water and install a nice patio, perhaps some stone pavers and a fire pit, you could easily increase your property value by 20% or more." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. "This standing water is a functioning wetland, Ms. Delaney, and I'm not planning to sell, ever." Her smile stayed fixed, but something cooled behind the sunglasses. "Silver Pines is working hard to create a unified aesthetic. Your habitat doesn't quite align with that vision." "Then maybe the vision needs adjusting," I said. She made a small note in a leather-bound planner, turned on her heel, and walked back to her vehicle. I watched those expensive shoes sink slightly into the soft earth and felt for just a moment a flicker of satisfaction. I told myself it was over. It wasn't. Surveyor flags began appearing along the boundary line, bright orange markers driven into the ground like tiny declarations of war. Then came the trucks, first small pickups, then larger flatbeds, carrying pumps and thick black hoses. One morning I walked out to find a teenage worker in a Silver Pines vest directing a backhoe near the southern Beaver Dam. "Who authorized this?" I asked, voice steady but loud enough to carry over the engine noise. He shrugged, chewing gum. "HOA. Said it was abandoned low ground needing drainage." "This is private property," I said, stepping between him and the machine. "Protected wetland. You're trespassing." He glanced at a clipboard. "They gave us paperwork." I called the sheriff's department. The deputy who arrived was polite but unhelpful. "Civil matter, sir. You'll need to pursue it through the courts." By the time I secured a temporary injunction, the pumps had already been running for days. The water level dropped visibly, pools shrank, mudflats widened, and the once lush cattails began to yellow at the edges. That evening, I stood on the elevated deck, watching moonlight ripple across cracked mud, where open water had been only weeks before. The air felt wrong, too dry, too silent. A single dead frog floated belly up in a shrinking puddle. The beavers were gone. I felt the old anger rise, the same anger I'd carried through decades of watching developers and bureaucrats carve up wild places. But beneath it was something heavier: grief. I had spent my life protecting other people's land. Now I was losing my own. Yet even as despair settled over me, I remembered my grandfather's words. "The land always answers back." I just didn't know yet how loud that answer would be. The first real escalation came on a gray November afternoon, when the wind carried the sharp scent of coming rain through the pines. I was out near the southern boundary, repairing a section of old fencing my grandfather had built from locust posts, when I heard the low rumble of heavy engines. 3 flatbed trucks rolled slowly down the HOA's newly graded service road, their tires crunching gravel. Men in neon vests unloaded industrial pumps, coils of thick black hose, and stacks of sandbags. They worked with the casual efficiency of people who believed they had every right to be there. I dropped my post hole digger and walked over boots sinking into the softening ground. Morning, I called, keeping my voice level. Mind telling me what this is about? The foreman, a stocky man with a Silver Pines clipboard, glanced up. Drainage improvement project. Orders from the board. On whose land? He checked his paperwork. Common area easement and adjacent low ground. Shouldn't take more than a few days. This isn't common area, I said, stepping closer. This is private property with a recorded conservation easement. You're standing in a state-protected wetland. He shrugged, already turning away. We've got authorization. Take it up with the office if you've got a problem. I pulled out my phone and started recording, slowly panning across faces, license plates, equipment serial numbers, and the bright orange surveyor flags that now ringed the southern pools like a noose. One of the younger workers noticed and muttered something to his partner. They exchanged uneasy glances, but kept working. By evening, the pumps were running. The steady mechanical thrum carried across the marsh like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I stood on the deck and watched dark water being sucked through the hoses and dumped into a culvert that fed straight into the HOA's stormwater system. The level dropped visibly by the hour, shallow ponds shrank to muddy depressions. Cattails leaned drunkenly as their roots lost anchorage, and the rich, loamy smell of healthy wetland began to sour into something stagnant and desperate. I called the sheriff again. Same answer. Civil matter. I called the county planning office. Voicemail. I emailed Sheila Norwood, my old EPA colleague, now consulting part-time, and attached time-stamped photos. She replied within minutes. This looks like a textbook Section 404 violation. Hold tight. I'll rattle some cages. 3 days later, the pumps fell silent. The marsh lay wounded, cracked mudflats where open water had been yellowing reeds, and a silence so complete it felt accusatory. The beavers had vanished entirely. Even their old lodge at the southern edge had collapsed inward without water to buoy it. A week after that, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived embossed with the same Silver Pine logo. I let it sit on the kitchen counter for 2 full days, brewing coffee around it like it was radioactive. When I finally opened it, the letter was everything I'd feared. Silver Pines Estates was formally petitioning the county to reclassify the degraded and underutilized portion of my land as a common-use easement. Their plan: convert the now dry basin into an amenity for the neighborhood, a lighted walking trail meditation garden, and most insulting of all, a decorative koi pond. A koi pond. I read that phrase 3 times, feeling something cold settle behind my ribs. Where rare bog turtles had once basked, where migratory rails had nested in secrecy, they wanted to stock ornamental fish and install underwater lights that would glow neon blue at night. I sat on the porch steps in the gathering dusk, letter clenched in my fist, and listened to the wind move through the dry cattails. It sounded like paper tearing. The invitation to the next HOA meeting arrived the following week. It was printed on heavy cardstock, worded with careful courtesy. As an adjacent landowner with vested interest, you are warmly invited to attend and participate in discussion of community enhancement initiatives. I almost threw it away. Instead, I pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a beaver and stared at it every morning over coffee. Against every instinct, I went. The clubhouse smelled of lemon polish and fresh paint. Rows of white folding chairs faced a long table draped in navy cloth. Residents in pressed khakis and tasteful jewelry sipped bottled water and scrolled phones. At the head table sat the 5 board members dressed as though attending a charity gala rather than a land grab. Karen Delaney occupied the center seat, radiant in pearl gray, a slim folder open in front of her. She greeted me with a smile calibrated to exactly the temperature of civility. Mr. Langley, thank you for coming. We appreciate your interest in the future of our community. I took a seat near the back. It's hard not to be interested when someone is trying to steal my land. A ripple of murmurs. Karen's smile never wavered. That's a strong characterization. We're simply exploring how the entire area, including your parcel, might better serve the neighborhood's needs. I leaned forward. My parcel is a designated wetland, protected under state and federal law. You drained it without permits. Now you claim it's degraded and want to pave it. That isn't exploration. That's theft. Karen gestured to a man beside her mid-50s expensive suit, salt and pepper hair, slicked back like a game show host. Our environmental consultant, Mr. Whitmore, can address the technical side. Whitmore stood clicking a remote. A PowerPoint slide appeared, a drone photo of my cracked dry marsh labeled Post-Degradation Assessment. Following recent hydrological changes, he began smoothly. The site no longer meets jurisdictional wetland criteria. Vegetation is stressed. Hydrology altered, soils compacted. In short, the area has lost its former ecological function. Rezoning for passive recreation would pose no further environmental impact. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. You altered the hydrology, I said, voice carrying without effort through the quiet room. You trespassed, pumped out protected waters without a single permit, killed habitat. And now you stand there declaring it degraded so you can build benches on it. Whitmore blinked. Karen interjected quickly. Mr. Langley, we acted in good faith based on professional advice. Good faith doesn't include lying to contractors and forging easement claims. I stood. This isn't a debate about aesthetics, it's a violation of the Clean Water Act, and I have the documentation to prove it. I didn't wait for rebuttal. I walked out while whispers rose behind me like startled birds. That night, I spread every scrap of paper I owned across the kitchen table. Deeds, surveys, conservation, easements. Decades of field notes, recent trail cam footage, water sample satellite images, before and after drainage. I scanned, labeled, and backed everything up to 3 separate drives. Then I made the calls that mattered. Sheila promised to file formal complaints with both EPA Region 4 and the state DEQ. Jacob, a young county planner I'd once mentored, agreed to pull permit records or the lack of them. A nonprofit wetland advocacy group in Raleigh offered pro bono legal review. While the human machinery began its slow grind, something else stirred in the marsh. Late one evening, walking the boundary with a flashlight, I caught movement near the upstream creek just beyond where the HOA's jurisdiction ended. Fresh chew marks on alder branches. Drag trails in the mud. A small but deliberate pile of sticks and mud anchoring the flow. The Beavers had come home. Not to their old lodge, they'd lost that, but to a narrow bend where water still moved freely. They worked under cover of darkness, silent and relentless, reshaping the channel with the same instinct that had guided their kind for millennia. I stood watching from the shadows, breath fogging in the cold, and felt the first flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Let the HOA believe they had won. Let them draft their walking trail blueprints and price out coy. The land was already writing its rebuttal, one branch at a time. Winter crept in slowly that year, the way it does in the mountains, first with a crisp bite in the mornings, then with frost, silvering the dead cattails until they glittered like broken glass. The marsh lay quiet under thin sheets of ice, the cracked mud frozen into jagged plates. No frogs sang. No herons stalked the shallows. Even the wind seemed to pass over the wounded ground without lingering. I spent those short days compiling evidence with the methodical patience I'd learned from decades in the field. Every photograph, every water sample, every frame of trail cam footage was cataloged, dated, and cross-referenced. I built a timeline on the kitchen wall with pushpins and red string, the way investigators do in movies, except this was real and the victim was 40 acres of living earth. Sheila called one evening just as the sun bled out behind the ridge. Good news and bad news, she said without preamble. Bad news first, the county's permit office has no record of any drainage application from Silver Pines. That means they went rogue. Good news, that's a slam dunk violation. I've got a contact at DEQ who's already drafting a notice of violation. I exhaled slowly, watching my breath fog the window. How long until it lands? Weeks, maybe months. Bureaucracy moves like cold molasses, but we're building a solid case. I thanked her and hung up, then stood on the porch staring across the barren flats. Somewhere out there beneath the frost, seeds and roots and eggs waited in suspended animation. Life wasn't gone. It was listening. Christmas came and went without ceremony. A quiet meal of venison stew and a single glass of bourbon raised to Ellen's memory. On New Year's Eve, I received another envelope from Silver Pines, this one certified mail. Inside was a glossy brochure, artist renderings of winding gravel paths, teak benches beneath string lights, a serene meditation gazebo, and center stage the proposed koi pond ringed with riverstone and lily pads. The caption read, Silver Pines Serenity Trail bringing harmony to our community. I pinned the brochure next to the timeline. Harmony, I thought. They'd murdered a wetland and were selling postcards of the corpse. January brought thaw and rain, steady, soaking mountain rain that turned the frozen mud to soup. Without the wetland to absorb it, runoff sheeted off the HOA's impervious roofs and driveways, pooling in low spots along my boundary before spilling into the creek downstream. I watched from the deck as brown water raced past, carrying lawn chemicals and loose topsoil with it. Then, one sleety afternoon, a county truck pulled into my drive. 2 code enforcement officers climbed out, clipboards in hand. "Mr. Langley, we've had a complaint about unpermitted structures and landscape non-compliance." I invited them onto the porch out of the weather. Let me guess, Silver Pines filed it. They exchanged glances. The older one nodded. They submitted documentation suggesting extended authority over adjacent properties for coordinated zoning. I handed them copies of the conservation easement and the original plat map. This land predates the HOA by half a century. No covenants apply. They took photos of the cabin, the shed, the deck, but their questions grew quieter, their postures less official. Before leaving, the younger officer paused. "Off the record, sir, this feels like a turf war. You might want an attorney." I already had 3 on speed dial. That same week, I drove into Asheville and met with a land use lawyer named Mara Chen. She spread my documents across her conference table like a poker hand and whistled low. "They've overplayed spectacularly," she said. "Unauthorized fill discharge, misrepresentation to contractors, attempted adverse possession through improvements. These aren't fines. These are felonies if the agencies push hard enough." She agreed to file for a permanent injunction and send demand letters. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. But the HOA wasn't finished. In early February, workers returned, this time with heavier equipment. I watched from the tree line as they installed concrete bollards along the boundary and began grading a narrow path through the dry basin. They strung yellow caution tape and erected small signs, "Future Home of Silver Pines Serenity Trail. Opening summer 2025. That evening, I found a new notice taped to my front door. No envelope, just a single sheet on HOA letterhead. "Dear adjacent landowner, drainage and landscape enhancements are ongoing for community safety and aesthetic improvement. We appreciate your cooperation during this exciting transformation. Silver Pines Estates Board of Directors." I crumpled it, then smoothed it out again and added it to the evidence wall. The next morning, I walked the boundary at dawn. The ground was still soft from overnight rain, and fresh tracks caught the low-light, broad, flat prints with claw marks ahead of the webbed hind feet. Beavers. Not just passing through, they'd been busy. I followed the trail upstream past the HOA's new bollards to a narrow choke point where the creek bent sharply. There, half hidden by overhanging alders, rose a new dam, small but solid, woven from branches and packed with mud that gleamed wet and dark. Water had already backed up behind it, forming a shallow pond that reflected the pale sky. My pulse quickened. The beavers hadn't returned to their old lodge. They'd chosen higher ground just outside HOA jurisdiction, in the exact spot where drainage had altered the slope. I crouched at the edge and studied the structure. It was textbook beaver engineering: primary dam, across the main flow, secondary sticks, reinforcing the bank's mud plaster, sealing every gap. They were responding to the new hydrology the HOA had forced upon the land. And in doing so, they were redirecting it. Downslope toward the manicured backyards of Silver Pines, the ground fell away gently. Impervious clay, compacted by heavy equipment, now saturated and unable to drain naturally. Without the wetland sponge below, any overflow would have only one place to go: straight into the neighborhood. I stood slowly, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in months. The land wasn't just listening. It was preparing its reply. That night, I set up 2 new trail cameras, one facing the dam, one angled toward the HOA lots. I checked the weather forecast, a warm front moving in heavy rain, expected by week's end. I brewed a pot of coffee, pulled a chair onto the porch, and waited for spring to do what spring does best in the mountains. It pours. Spring arrived with the subtlety of a held breath, finally released. One morning, the air carried the faint, sweet promise of green things waking underground, and by afternoon the red maples along the creek were laced with tiny crimson buds. The frost-heaved mud softened into something almost forgiving underfoot. I walked the boundary every dawn, coffee thermos in hand, watching for signs. The beavers did not disappoint. What had started as a modest barricade in February had grown into a formidable structure 6 feet high at the center, curving gracefully across the creek like a living wall of interwoven branches, stones, and meticulously packed mud. Fresh chew marks ringed the trunks of young poplars and willows they'd felled with surgical precision. Each night I could hear them from the cabin, the steady slap of flat tails on water, the muffled crunch of teeth through wood, the soft splash as they dove and resurfaced with another load. I kept my distance, speaking to them only in quiet thoughts. No interference, no encouragement, just observation and documentation. The trail cameras captured it all in infrared silence. 2 adults, sleek and purposeful, guiding 3 kits born the previous year. They worked in shifts, one feeding, while the others built as if they understood the urgency of the season. Behind the dam, water spread into a widening pond that gleamed like polished steel under the strengthening sun. Submerged stumps became perches for turtles. Dragonflies returned in shimmering clouds. A pair of wood ducks exploded from the reeds one morning, their wings whistling as they circled overhead before settling again. Life coaxed back by nothing more than instinct and time. And downhill, the consequences began to show. The HOA had graded their backyards to a gentle, uniform slope perfect for lawn chairs, and playsets terrible for holding water. Without the wetland below to act as a sponge, every rain now sheeted across compacted clay and pooled against foundation walls. The first signs were subtle soggy patches of new sod, turning yellow, then brown. Fence posts along the rear property line began to lean like tired sentries. A concrete patio at the edge of one lot cracked along a hairline fracture that widened with each freeze-thaw cycle. I watched it unfold from the ridge above, binoculars in hand, feeling no triumph, only a deep, quiet recognition. Nature wasn't punishing anyone. It was simply resuming its ancient conversation with gravity. One Saturday, in late March, a landscaping crew arrived to correct the problem. They installed perforated drain pipe along the back fence lines and hauled in loads of gravel to create French drains. I stood on my side of the boundary, arms folded as the foreman barked orders. Should fix the saturation issue, he called over the noise of a backhoe. Water'll percolate right down. I didn't argue, I just nodded and walked away. That night, the rain came steady, warm, relentless. By midnight, the new pond behind the beaver dam had risen nearly 2 feet. I sat on the porch in a slicker lantern off, listening to water spill over the top of the structure in a soft, continuous roar. It followed the path of least resistance, the very channels the HOA had carved for their stormwater, now swollen beyond design. The next morning, I followed the flow. It had carved a shallow rivulet through the dead cattails, then veered sharply toward the neighborhood. The French drains were overwhelmed within hours. Gravel washed away in muddy streams. Backyards turned to shallow lakes. One resident's brand-new playset listed sideways as the ground beneath it liquefied. By evening, 3 homes on the lowest tier had water lapping at their foundation vents. Pumps hummed late into the night, sucking brown water into tanker trucks that idled along the curb. I watched from the shadows of the tree line, the air thick with the smell of wet soil and diesel. Karen Delaney appeared at dusk, standing in her driveway in designer rain boots, arms crossed tight as she surveyed the damage. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders. She made several phone calls, voice sharp, gesturing at the darkening sky, as if it had personally betrayed her. The neighborhood's online forum, still visible through an old resident account I'd never deleted, lit up with confusion and complaints. Anyone else dealing with backyard flooding, we just had the drainage fixed. My basement sump pump hasn't stopped since yesterday. Did something change upstream? This never happened before. Someone posted a drone photo of the beaver dam, captioned simply, "What the hell is this?" Replies poured in. Theories ranged from vandalism to climate change. No one mentioned the wetland they'd drained. Not yet. I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The moon hung low and full, turning the new pond into a mirror of silver light. A beaver swam across it in slow, deliberate strokes, carrying a branch twice its length. It paused at the dam, assessed, then wedged the branch into place with practiced efficiency. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. The land had found its voice, and it was only getting louder. April brought the kind of rain the mountains are famous for, warm, heavy, and unrelenting. The sort that turns creeks into torrents and makes the air smell like wet stone and resurrection. I woke one Tuesday to the steady drum on the tin roof and a feeling in my gut that today would matter. By mid-morning, the Beaver Dam was spilling over in a wide, even sheet, the overflow carving new channels through the soft earth. I pulled on my old Forest Service rain jacket, grabbed the good camera, and walked the boundary. Water raced downhill in muddy rivulets, following the graded slope the HOA had so carefully engineered. It pooled against their rear fences, seeped under gates, and began to undermine the fresh sod like a slow, patient thief. Then the trucks returned. This time they came in force, 2 large pump rigs, a track hoe, and a flatbed loaded with sandbags. They parked half on HOA land, half on mine, and began setting up without a word to me. I stood 20 yards away recording everything. The foreman from the earlier job spotted me and walked over, rain dripping from the brim of his hard hat. "Morning, sir. We're authorized to deepen the drainage swale and reinforce the outflow." "Authorized by whom?" I asked. "Board Directive, Emergency Flood Mitigation." I pointed to the orange flags still marking my boundary. "That swale crosses private property. You don't have my permission." He hesitated, glanced at his crew, already uncoiling hoses, then shrugged. "We've got paperwork saying it's a shared easement now." I stepped directly into his path. "Show me." He radioed someone. 10 minutes later, Karen Delaney arrived in her white SUV umbrella, blooming like a challenge. She stepped out in tall rubber boots and a navy trench coat, hair perfect despite the downpour. "Mr. Langley," she called over the rain, "this is an urgent safety measure. Standing water is threatening foundations." "Water you redirected by draining my wetland," I said. "You don't get to break the law twice to fix the first break." Her smile was thin and sharp. "We're simply restoring proper drainage. If you obstruct, we'll have to involve the sheriff." "Do it," I said. "I'll wait." She stared at me for a long moment, rain streaking her makeup just enough to reveal the strain beneath. Then she nodded to the foreman. The pumps started with a mechanical growl. I kept filming. Every hose laid across my line. Every sandbag stacked on my soil. Every minute they worked without permit or permission. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, same one as before, he took statements, looked uncomfortable, and left with the familiar refrain, "Civil matter." By late afternoon, they had deepened the trench through the heart of what used to be my southern pond, routing water into a newly dug culvert that dumped straight into the HOA's stormwater basin. The marsh bled faster now, the last pools shrinking before my eyes. A great blue heron lifted off with a hoarse protest and did not return. That night, I sat at the kitchen table until the small hours, rage and grief wrestling in my chest. I printed stills from the footage, labeled them with timestamps and GPS coordinates, and added them to the growing case file. Then I opened a fresh page in my field journal and wrote a single line in block letters. "They think the land is dead. They are wrong." The next day, I drove to the county courthouse and filed an emergency motion for injunction with Mara Chen. She met me in the lobby, took one look at my face, and ushered me into a conference room. "They're escalating," I told her, spreading the new photos across the table. "Trespass, destruction of protected habitat, falsified easement claims." She studied the images in silence, then nodded. "We go hard. I'll request an immediate cease and desist and ask for a site inspection by DEQ within 72 hours. While she worked the phones, I drove home through curtains of rain. The pumps were still running when I pulled in 2 of them, now lights strung along the trench like a perverse carnival. Workers in reflective vests moved through the glare ghosts in the storm. I walked out to the deck and stood in the downpour until I was soaked through. The sound of the pumps filled the valley, a mechanical heartbeat, drowning out everything else. I felt the old limp ache in my leg, the same one earned dragging hose lines through burning forests to save places no one would ever thank me for. But this one I would not lose. At dusk, the rain eased to a steady hiss. I shut off the cabin lights and walked the boundary in darkness, flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust. Upstream past the chaos of pumps and trenches, the Beaver Dam still held. Water roared over its crest in a smooth cascade, feeding the very channels the HOA had deepened. I crouched at the edge of the new trench and shone my light into the rushing flow. It was carrying more than water now. Fine silt bits of leaf litter the first green shoots of willow that had tried to sprout in the disturbed soil. All of it pouring downhill straight toward the luxury homes whose foundations sat naked without their natural buffer. I turned off the light and stood listening to the rain on the leaves. The beavers had not stopped working either. Fresh branches lay stacked along the upstream bank, ready for the next phase. They were adapting faster than any committee ever could. I whispered into the dark, not a prayer exactly, more a promise. Let them dig deeper. Let them pump harder. Let them think they're winning. The land remembers every wound. And spring was far from over. That night, I moved the best trail camera to a new position high in an oak, overlooking both the beaver dam and the HOA's vulnerable backyards. I set it to time-lapse battery fresh memory card, empty. Then I went inside, brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint, and waited for the next storm. It was already gathering in the west, purple clouds, stacking like judgment on the horizon. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in early May. The kind of Appalachian deluge that feels personal, warm rain, driven sideways by wind that howls through the gaps like something ancient waking up. I had watched the forecast all week. A slow-moving front stalled over the Blue Ridge, dumping inches of water with no place to go. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised pewter, and the air hung so heavy I could taste the metallic edge of lightning on my tongue. I sat on the covered porch with a thermos of coffee gone cold, hours ago, blanket over my shoulders, listening to the first fat drops hiss against the leaves. The beaver dam, now a sturdy 8-foot crescent of interwoven alder poplar and mud, stood dark and defiant upstream. Water already sheeted over its crest in a steady roar, glowing faintly whenever lightning stitched the clouds. At 1:47 a.m., my phone buzzed, with a motion alert from the trail camera overlooking the HOA lots. I opened the live feed and watched breath held as the redirected flow hit the neighborhood like a slow-motion wave. It started at the lowest house on Hawthorne Lane, a sprawling modern build with floor-to-ceiling windows and a stone patio Karen had once bragged about at the clubhouse. Water poured through the compromised French drains, surged across the lawn, and slammed into the foundation wall. Within minutes, the patio furniture began to float, teak chairs drifting like rafts, a heavy grill tipping sideways with a distant metallic groan. The sliding glass doors held for a while, then surrendered. Brown water rushed inside, carrying silt and debris across pale hardwood floors. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark white water, already ankle-deep in the garage reflections of floating storage bins dancing on the surface. By 2:30 a.m., the flood had claimed 5 homes. The decorative bridge the HOA had installed over a dry swale meant to be picturesque was completely submerged, its solar lanterns flickering underwater like drowning stars. The meditation garden they'd begun grading was now a churning mud pit. Their prized koi pond, half-finished, ringed with imported boulders, had become a swirling vortex, sucking in lawn ornaments, overturned planters, and a child's plastic slide that bobbed past like a bright yellow surrender flag. I stayed on the porch through it all, rain drumming on the roof, coffee finally empty. I felt no glee, only a profound aching recognition. This was not vengeance. It was consequence, pure and impartial, delivered by gravity and instinct. At 3:12 a.m., the power went out in Silver Pines. Porch lights winked off one by one, leaving only the occasional lightning strobe and the red blink of backup sump pumps struggling against the inevitable. I could hear them from across the boundary, desperate mechanical whines rising and falling like cries. Sirens arrived around 4 fire department pump trucks, their diesel engines rumbling as they positioned along the curb. Flashlights swept across flooded yards, illuminating residents in pajamas and raincoats wading through knee-deep water to salvage what they could. One man stood on his deck shouting into a phone voice cracking with disbelief. A woman clutched a sodden photo album to her chest and wept openly. Karen's house was among the hardest hit. Her beloved patio disappeared entirely under a lake of runoff. The koi pond she had fought so hard to impose on my land now mocked her with its own chaos. Boulders displaced liner, torn the whole feature, transformed into a muddy crater that swallowed her expensive outdoor kitchen island. I watched her silhouette appear at an upstairs window, backlit by a battery lantern. She stood motionless for a long time, staring out at the ruin. Even from a distance, I could sense the shock rolling off her the moment when certainty cracks and something colder seeps in. By dawn, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. Pale light revealed the full-extent lawns eroded into gullies, retaining walls slumped like melting wax basements filled to the ceiling joists. The air smelled of wet earth gasoline from spilled lawn equipment and something faintly electric from shorted wiring. Emergency crews worked through the morning, pumping water into tanker trucks that lined the streets like a funeral procession. Insurance adjusters arrived in sedans, clipboards already filling with grim estimates. Residents gathered in small knots, voices low, faces drawn with exhaustion, and the first stirrings of anger. I walked the boundary at mid-morning, boots squelching in the saturated soil. My side of the line remained largely untouched, the elevated cabin safe. The recovering marsh upstream drinking in the rain and releasing it slowly the way it was meant to. The Beaver Dam stood proud and intact, water still flowing over it in a controlled, even curtain. A family of otters played in the new pond behind it, sliding down muddy chutes with abandon. One of the firefighters noticed me watching and waved me over. "You the guy who lives up in the woods?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the chill. "That's me." He shook his head, gazing at the devastation. "Never seen anything quite like this." All that water came from one direction, straight out of that creek. Like someone turned a faucet on the whole neighborhood. I said nothing, just nodded. He glanced upstream toward the dam, visible now in daylight. "Beavers did this." "Beavers did what beavers do," I replied. "They dammed the creek after the flow changed." He whistled low. "Well, they picked one hell of a spot." That afternoon, the HOA sent out its first mass email, terse and carefully neutral. Due to extreme weather, several properties have experienced water intrusion. We are coordinating with emergency services and insurance providers. Please stay safe and report damage to management. No mention of cause. No admission of fault. But the neighborhood forum told a different story. Posts poured in by the hour. My entire finished basement is gone. Everything. Who approved building this close to that swamp? We were told the drainage was improved. This is improved. Someone uploaded a video taken from a second-story window, the flood in real time, water rising visibly minute by minute, patio furniture swirling away. It already had hundreds of views. I closed the laptop and stepped back outside. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and sharp. A kingfisher rattled overhead, diving into the new upstream pond and emerging with a flashing minnow. Life, indifferent to human drama, was already reclaiming its rhythm. The land had spoken its first full sentence, and the conversation was just beginning. The days after the storm felt suspended in a strange, sodden hush. The neighborhood smelled of mud and mildew, laced with the sharp tang of sump pumps running non-stop. Emergency fans whirred from open garage doors, blowing out the damp breath of ruined carpet and drywall. Piles of sodden furniture lined the curbs like casualties, couches swollen beyond recognition. Mattresses sagging under their own weight. Children's toys bleached and warped. Karen Delaney held an emergency HOA meeting that Sunday afternoon under a rented white tent in the community parking lot. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, many residents still in rubber boots and hoodies, faces etched with exhaustion and barely contained fury. The clubhouse was too damaged to use. Black mold already bloomed on its lower walls. I wasn't invited, of course, but a sympathetic resident, someone whose basement photography studio had been destroyed, slid a USB drive under my door that evening. No note, just the recording. I watched it on my laptop, with the volume low, the cabin quiet, except for the distant croak of returning frogs. Karen stood at the front beneath harsh portable lights, navy blazer, pristine despite everything, hair pulled back severely. She gripped a clipboard like a shield. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, voice steady but pitched higher than usual. "We've endured an extraordinary weather event, a once-in-a-century rainfall. The board is working around the clock with county emergency services, insurance carriers, and restoration contractors to support every affected household." A man in the front row, mid-40s, face sunburned from days of cleanup, raised his hand without waiting. "With respect, Karen, this wasn't just weather. Our homes flooded from one direction. Upstream. Something changed the flow." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened. "We're investigating all factors," she said smoothly, including natural wildlife activity that may have contributed to unintended water diversion. The room erupted. Wildlife activity. A woman stood clutching printouts. You mean the beavers? The ones that moved in after you drained the wetland we were assured was no longer functional. Karen lifted a hand. The wetland in question had already degraded. Because you pumped it dry, someone shouted from the back. The tent filled with overlapping voices. Residents held up phone screens showing before and after photos. Drone shots of the beaver dam, screenshots of engineering reports they'd begun requesting on their own. One man played a video on his tablet, the flood in real-time water rising inexorably across his backyard. My insurance adjuster says this may not be covered, he said, voice breaking. They're calling it surface water redirection due to third-party alterations. That third party is us, Karen, the HOA. Karen tried to regain control. We followed professional guidance. What professionals? Another voice cut in. The consultant, who said the marsh was dead after you killed it. The accusations came faster now, sharp and personal. You told us building here was safe. You rushed the drainage to save on planting costs. My toddler's room had 2 feet of water. We found mold this morning. Karen's composure cracked. Color rose in her cheeks. She raised her voice over the din. I have done everything for this community. We turned raw land into a premier neighborhood. We increased property values. We created amenities people begged for. A woman near the front stood slowly holding a water-stained photo of her flooded kitchen. We didn't beg for this. The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then someone else spoke low and dangerous. We want your resignation, tonight. The demand spread like wildfire. Hands shot up. Voices joined in chorus. Karen looked around for allies. The other board members sat stone-faced, eyes averted. One quietly gathered his folder and slipped out a side flap. Karen tried one last time. This is not the moment for division. We need unity. No, the sunburned man said. We need accountability. The recording ended abruptly as someone knocked over the camera tripod in the chaos. By Monday morning, the neighborhood forum had become a battlefield. Posts demanding audits, resignations, even dissolution of the HOA entirely. Someone leaked an internal email chain, Karen instructing contractors to accelerate drainage quietly to avoid permit delays. The screenshot spread like the floodwaters themselves. If we wait for full approval, we miss the landscaping window. Proceed with discretion. Discretion. That word echoed through dozens of comments, each more furious than the last. Karen attempted damage control with a press release, emailed to every resident, and copied to local media. Silver Pines Estates experienced severe flooding due to extreme weather and upstream wildlife activity. We are exploring all options, including humane relocation of invasive beavers that have altered natural drainage patterns. Some have suggested deliberate ecological interference, which we take seriously and will investigate fully. Invasive beavers, deliberate interference. I read it twice, then printed it and pinned it to my evidence wall beside the leaked email. She was pointing fingers at me now, at the land itself, as if nature had conspired rather than simply responded. That afternoon, a local news van parked at the entrance to Silver Pines. A young reporter in a bright yellow raincoat stood in front of the ruined koi pond, now a crater filled with debris, and delivered her stand-up. Residents here are asking hard questions tonight after a beaver dam upstream redirected massive rainfall into their backyards. Some blame the Homeowners Association for removing a natural wetland buffer without proper permits. The HOA president calls it an unforeseen natural event and hints at possible intentional wildlife encouragement by a neighboring landowner. The camera panned to Karen, composed again, standing on her cleared driveway. We're cooperating fully with investigators, she said, but we won't rule out any possibility, including ecological tampering. I turned off the television and stepped outside. The air had cleared after the storm, carrying the clean scent of wet pine and rebirth. Frogs chorused from the recovering pools. A pair of beavers swam lazily across the upstream pond kits, trailing behind like ducklings. Tampering. I almost laughed. That evening, Sheila called, voice tight with excitement. The DEQ just issued an emergency site inspection order. They're coming tomorrow, full team. And the EPA has opened a formal Section 404 investigation based on my complaint and your documentation. How soon until charges? Patience, she said, but Karen just handed them probable cause on a silver platter. Blaming protected wildlife for damage caused by unpermitted fill. That's an admission the wetland served a flood control function. I looked out at the moonlit dam water murmuring over its crest in a steady, soothing song. The land had roared once. Now it was whispering the rest of the story. And everyone finally was listening. The reckoning came faster than even Sheila had predicted. On a humid morning in late May, 3 unmarked white SUVs with state plates rolled slowly down the flooded streets of Silver Pines. They parked in front of Karen's house, its foundation still wrapped in blue tarps and industrial dehumidifiers, humming like angry bees. A team of 5 stepped out, 2 from the North Carolina DEQ, 2 from the EPA regional office, and 1 county floodplain manager. I recognized Tomas Alvarez, the same man who had once called me with a warning about Karen's desperate complaint. I was out taking water samples when Tomas spotted me on the ridge. He waved me down. "You're gonna want to walk with us," he said quietly. "This is the real deal." We moved as a group along the boundary boots sinking into the softening ground. I pointed out the original wetland delineation markers, faded but still visible, then the unauthorized trenches, the collapsed beaver lodge, the concrete bollards installed without permits. The investigators took soil cores, measured elevations with laser levels, and photographed everything in meticulous detail. When we reached the beaver dam, the team paused. Water murmured steadily over its crest, clear and cold, feeding the recovering pools below. A kit beaver watched us curiously, from a half-submerged log before slipping silently beneath the surface. One of the EPA agents, a woman named Marcia Duvall, with steel-gray hair and mud-splattered boots, turned to me. "Mr. Langley, your documentation matches what we're seeing on the ground. The wetland hydrology is rebounding exactly as it should once the illegal drainage ceased." I nodded. The beavers did most of the heavy lifting. She gave a small appreciative smile. Nature's best engineers. Tomas pulled me aside while the others worked. "Karen tried to file a formal complaint against you, well against the wetland, claiming you encouraged wildlife to divert water maliciously. She even submitted her own drainage plans as evidence." I raised an eyebrow, and she dated and signed them. No permits attached, no hydrology review. Straight admission of unpermitted work. He shook his head, almost laughing. She gift-wrapped probable cause. By evening, the neighborhood forum had exploded again. Someone with access to county records posted the inspection notice, "Immediate cease and desist," on all HOA land alterations, pending full investigation into Clean Water Act violations, riparian buffer infractions, and misrepresentation of zoning. Residents who had once defended Karen now turned on her with the ferocity of people who felt betrayed twice, first by the flood, then by the truth. She knew it was illegal and did it anyway. My insurance denied the claim because of known hydrological risk. Known to whom? We're forming a committee. No more blind trust. 3 board members resigned within 48 hours, citing personal reasons. The HOA's Facebook page went dark after a barrage of 1-star reviews and photos of moldy basements. Someone spray-painted "Wetland Killers" in dripping red letters across the clubhouse portico before it was hastily covered with plywood. Karen made one last public appearance, a press conference on her front lawn, now stripped of sod and ringed with caution tape. Local news crews gathered as she stood in a crisp white trench coat, sunglasses, hiding whatever storm raged behind her eyes. "This community has been victimized by an extreme natural event," she declared, voice steady but thinner than before. "We are also concerned about upstream activities that may have intentionally exacerbated flooding. We will pursue every avenue to protect our residents." A reporter asked directly, "Are you accusing your neighbor of engineering this flood with beavers?" Karen hesitated a fraction too long. "We are investigating all possibilities." The clip aired that night. By morning, it was mocked across regional media. HOA president blames beavers for revenge plot. Memes spread beavers in hard hats. Beavers holding tiny blueprints, beavers sipping martinis on flooded patios. I watched none of it. Instead, I walked the marsh at dusk, watching cattails push new green spears through the mud, listening to the chorus of spring peepers that had returned in force. The air smelled of life, again rich, loamy, electric, with possibility. Sheila called late that week with the official word. "Charges are coming," she said. "Multiple counts unauthorized discharge into waters of the U.S. destruction of protected wetland false statements to contractors and regulators. The DEQ is recommending the maximum civil penalties. Criminal referral is on the table for Karen personally. I sat on the porch steps, cradling the phone, feeling the weight of years lift just a little. And the restoration order, already drafted, full hydrological and vegetative recovery to pre-disturbance conditions, funded by HOA fines and assessments. And Thomas, they want you as the official stewardship consultant. Paid position, your rules. I exhaled slowly. Tell them yes. 2 days later, a courier delivered a thick packet from the state formal notice of violation itemized penalties totaling $427,000 and the emergency restoration directive. My name appeared as required technical advisor and on-site monitor. That same afternoon, a moving truck backed into Karen's driveway. Neighbors watched from windows as movers carried out furniture, wrapped in plastic designer sofas, abstract art, the massive outdoor kitchen island salvaged from the flood. Karen emerged once directing traffic in sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. She didn't look toward my cabin. By nightfall, the house stood empty, a for sale sign staked crookedly in the muddy lawn. The forum lit up one last time with a post from an anonymous account later revealed to be the former treasurer who had quietly copied years of emails. Attached was the full chain, Karen's instructions to proceed quietly, override permit requirements, reclassify the wetland as non-functional after drainage. The final message dated the week before the big storm. Mr. Langley's obstructionism ends now. Accelerate all improvements. We control the narrative. The comments beneath it were unanimous. Resignation demands became calls for dissolution. A special meeting was scheduled not in a tent this time, but in the high school auditorium to accommodate the crowd. The remaining board announced they would step down voluntarily and hand governance to an interim resident committee until a full audit and election could be held. Silver Pines Estates, as Karen had built it, was finished. I stood on the ridge that evening and watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the recovering marsh in molten gold. Water reflected the sky like a promise kept. A great blue heron landed in the shallows with prehistoric grace, folding wings that had returned because the land had called them home. The beavers swam past the dam in formation, adults leading kits tumbling playfully in their wake. They paused to groom on a mud bank, utterly indifferent to the human drama that had swirled around them. They hadn't sought revenge. They had simply rebuilt their world, and in doing so, they had dismantled hers. The land had not forgotten. It had only waited. The formal hearing took place on a sweltering July afternoon in the Buncombe County Municipal Building, a squat air-conditioned relic with flickering fluorescence and the faint perpetual smell of old paper and lemon disinfectant. It was a joint session county planning, state DEQ, and regional EPA compliance officers seated behind a long table like judges at a quiet trial. No cameras, no spectators beyond the parties involved, just facts, documents, and the slow grind of accountability. I was called last. Most of the day had been consumed by the HOA's remaining representatives. 2 nervous attorneys in rumpled suits, flipping through binders and repeating variations of unforeseen natural variability and good faith community enhancement. Karen sat 3 seats from the end, silent and diminished in a plain linen dress, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She had not spoken once. Whatever fire had driven her to drain my marsh seemed extinguished, replaced by the hollow look of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in slow motion. When my name was called, I rose slowly, carrying a waterproof case, a laptop, and a rolled topographic map under one arm. My boots, still flecked with honest mud, left faint prints on the linoleum as I walked to the front. I introduced myself simply, Thomas Langley, retired senior field ecologist, U.S. Forest Service, 25 years in watershed and wildlife management. I opened the laptop and began. The first slide was a high-resolution satellite image from 2 years earlier, 40 acres of vibrant wetland, glowing in deep greens and blues, braided channels catching sunlight, forest edges sharp and healthy. I let it linger. This was the site before Silver Pines Estates initiated unpermitted drainage. Next slide, the same view, after the pumps had done their work, cracked. Mudflats, yellowed vegetation, collapsed, Beaver Lodge. The contrast was stark enough to draw an audible intake of breath from someone at the table. I moved through the evidence with the calm precision of a lifetime spent testifying on wildfire impacts and habitat loss. Time-lapse trail cam footage of the illegal pumps running day and night. The leaked email chain, including Karen's directive to proceed quietly and avoid permit delays. GIS overlays showing exactly how the HOA's unauthorized culverts and grading had altered slope and flow, funneling water directly into their own foundations. The 1982 conservation easement signed by my grandfather and a state commissioner, still legally binding. Signed affidavits from Sheila Norwood and other experts confirming multiple violations of the Clean Water Act and North Carolina riparian buffer rules. Water quality data pre-drainage samples, rich in dissolved oxygen post-drainage samples, choked with sediment and lawn chemicals. I ended with a 20-second video clip of beaver at twilight, dragging a heavy branch through shallow water, wedging it into the dam with deliberate, practiced movements. The camera caught the soft splash as it dove the ripple spreading across the pond like quiet applause. That I said closing the laptop is the only engineer who altered the floodplain, and it acted in direct response to the illegal drainage that displaced its home. The room was silent. Rebecca Nash, the DEQ director presiding, removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Mr. Langley, did you at any time modify structures or encourage wildlife to influence water flow? No, ma'am. I observed, documented, and reported violations through proper channels. The Beavers followed instinct and hydrology. One of the HOA attorneys stood. With respect, the dam's location and timing could suggest. I turned to him. The dam's location follows the new flow path you created when you drained protected waters. Beavers build where water moves. You gave them water. They used it. He sat down without finishing. Rebecca looked to her colleagues, then back to me. Your documentation is comprehensive. Thank you. As the session adjourned, I packed slowly. Karen remained seated long after the others filed out. When the room was nearly empty, she finally spoke, voice so low I almost missed it. You planned this. I paused at the door. No, you did. I just refused to let you forget what you broke. She didn't reply. 2 weeks later, the rulings arrived in a thick certified envelope. Immediate suspension of all new development permits in Silver Pines estates. Civil penalties totaling $385,000 against the HOA, with personal liability assessments pending against former board members. A mandatory full restoration order returned the wetland to pre-disturbance hydrological and vegetative condition within 18 months, monitored by state-approved experts. My appointment as paid stewardship consultant with final sign-off authority on every restoration milestone. That same month, a grant from the North Carolina Wetlands Restoration Program and a partnership with UNC Asheville's Environmental Science Department turned the 40 acres into an official research and education site, the Langley Wetland Sanctuary. We broke ground, or rather broke water, on a crisp September morning. Volunteers from the neighborhood showed up in work gloves and borrowed boots. Some were the same residents who had once complained about unkempt vegetation. Now they planted willow cuttings, spread native seed mix, and hauled away remnants of the HOA's concrete bollards under the guidance of Ross, the contractor, who had quietly come to respect beavers more than boardrooms. Children from the local elementary school arrived on yellow buses, wide-eyed, to release fingerling salamanders into the shallows and learn how wetlands filter water and store carbon. College students installed monitoring wells and bird blinds. A retired engineer from Silver Pines designed solar-powered water level gauges that transmitted data in real time. The new resident-led Eco Alliance grew quickly. They organized cleanups, led bird walks, and funded interpretive signs along a raised boardwalk Ross and I designed to wind harmlessly above the sensitive soils. One sign featured my grandfather's quote, hand-lettered in weathered cedar. Nature doesn't forgive or punish. She remembers. She adapts. At the official dedication ceremony in early October, a small crowd gathered at the new trailhead. The bronze plaque gleamed under a clear mountain sky. The Langley Wetland Sanctuary, restored through the resilience of nature, protected through the persistence of one dedicated to those who listen before they act. I stood off to the side in my old field jacket, arms folded, watching neighbors who once saw me as an obstacle now smile and nod in quiet recognition. A teenage girl approached shyly, holding her phone. Mr. Langley, could we get a photo with you and the beaver dam for our Eco Alliance page? I smiled. The Beavers prefer anonymity, but take all the pictures of the dam you want. They don't mind the credit." She laughed and ran off to join her friends. Later, walking the boardwalk alone at dusk, I paused where the path overlooked the main pond. Cattails rustled in the breeze. A muskrat swam a lazy figure 8. Overhead, a flock of wood ducks wheeled against the orange sky before settling into the reeds with soft whistles. The marsh sang again, full-throated, unbroken. The land had healed, and in healing itself, it had taught an entire neighborhood how to listen. Spring returned the following year like a long-held breath, finally released, soft and full of promise. I woke one April morning to the sound of red-winged blackbirds calling from the cattails, their songs sharp and joyous against the pale sky. The frost had lifted for good. The ground no longer resisted my boots, but yielded with the gentle give of living soil. Willow shoots that had struggled through the restoration now stood tall and leafy, swaying in a breeze that carried the clean scent of open water and new growth. I walked the boardwalk slowly, coffee steaming in my hand, pausing at each interpretive sign the Eco Alliance had installed. Children's fingerprints still smudged the QR codes from last week's school visits. One panel explained how wetlands slow floodwaters and filter pollutants. Another told the quiet story of the Beavers' master architects, who had, without malice or intent, rewritten the neighborhood's fate. My grandfather's words remain carved at the trailhead, weathered but clear. Nature doesn't forgive or punish. She remembers. She adapts. The frogs were deafening now, a rolling, overlapping chorus that rose each evening like a hymn to survival. Not the tentative peeps of tentative return, but the deep, confident roar of a place that had endured machines and arrogance and paperwork, and come out whole on the other side. I stopped at the overlook where the boardwalk curved above the main pond. Sunlight glittered on the water, broken into 1,000 moving coins. A muskrat surfaced with a mouthful of cattail root, regarded me with dark, bright eyes, then vanished with hardly a ripple. Overhead, a kingfisher rattled past Dove with a splash and rose triumphant, with a minnow flashing silver in its beak. The Beaver Dam, now mature and intricate, layered with seasons of reinforcement, stood strong at the far bend. The family had expanded 2 new kits, tumbled along the muddy bank while the adults patrolled with calm authority. They had no need to redirect water anymore. The wetland below held and released it gently, the way it always had. Their work had shifted from defiance to harmony. Some afternoons, residents from Silver Pines wandered down the trail, families pushing strollers. Older couples holding hands, teenagers with sketchbooks or phones raised to record birds. They moved quietly, as if entering a sanctuary in the truest sense. A few nodded to me in passing. Some stopped to ask questions about the plants or the water levels. One man, the same sunburned resident who had challenged Karen under the tent, paused one evening and offered a simple apology. "We should have listened sooner," he said. I shook my head. The land did the teaching. I was just the messenger. He smiled, a little embarrassed, and walked on. The old HOA was gone, entirely replaced by a lean resident council focused on maintenance and stewardship rather than control. Fines had been paid, lawsuits settled, insurance claims resolved. Karen's name appeared occasionally in legal notices, but she had vanished from the area, no forwarding address, no trace. The house that had once gleamed with faux stone pride sold at a steep loss to a young couple who immediately ripped out the remaining impervious patio and planted native grasses along the slope. The Langley Wetland Sanctuary became more than a name on a plaque. Graduate students from UNC Asheville returned each season to monitor water quality, bird populations, amphibian breeding success. Their reports, published now in journals, cited the site as a remarkable case study in rapid ecological recovery following enforcement of protective laws. Children grew up knowing the story how arrogance tried to pave over a marsh, how beavers answered with branches and mud, how a neighborhood learned to listen. I kept my distance from most gatherings. I didn't need ceremonies or gratitude. What I needed was mornings like this, mist rising off the water, the low honk of a heron lifting from the reeds, the steady heartbeat of a place restored. One evening in late May, I sat on the cabin porch as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in slow strokes of rose and gold. A beaver tail slapped the pond in the distance, a sharp echoing crack that sent rings across the surface and scattered a flock of ducks into brief flight. I raised my mug in answer. The land had been wounded deeply, but it had healed lush, resilient, alive. And in its healing, it had restored something in me I thought lost forever, the quiet certainty that some things are stronger than greed, stronger than concrete, stronger than any committee's vision. Nature doesn't retaliate. She endures. She remembers. And when given the chance, she begins again. I finished my coffee, set the mug aside, and listened to the marsh settle into night frogs, crickets, the soft splash of beavers going about their eternal work. The sanctuary breathed around me whole and unbroken. And for the first time in years, so did I.